Census figures show the United States poverty rate rising more than 12% in 2022, the latest year for which figures are available. It is the largest one-year jump on record. The cost of living also rose at the same time. Federal programs introduced during the pandemic expired. And as Tiansan reports from Los Angeles.
Despite a strong job market and wages going up across the United States, the country's poverty rate last year has seen the largest ever jump in a single year.
It's a very large jump, and it absolutely means that Americans are being impacted by some of the economic changes that we've been experiencing, but also just reductions in the amount of sort of safety net supports that Americans have access to now, especially families with children.
The latest figures from the U.S. Census Bureau show the poverty rate rose to 12.4% in 2022 from 7.8% in 2021, while poverty among children more than doubled to 12.4% from a record low of 5.2% the year before. The increases follow 2 years of historic gains that were made in poverty reduction, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic era government assistance programs like payouts and the child tax credit.
The federal government intervened, directed benefits toward families, or toward all taxpayers, but to families with children in particular, and that directly reduced poverty rates. Once they took those benefits away, that sort of support, then poverty bounced right back to where it was.
As the federal public health emergency over COVID-19 came to an end, so did the government assistance programs to pay for rent, healthcare, and food.
What they're up against is having to make a decision between paying rent or buying food, or taking medicine advised by their doctor, or putting food on their table. And so I think, we're going to continue to see that for a little bit, because even though folks are back to work, wages are still lagging a little bit, maybe hours aren't consistent, it's still going to continue to be a challenge.
As the income gap continues to widen, experts point at the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic to address the growing crisis.
The one thing that was revealed, and this is maybe a silver lining, is that when we expanded the child tax credit, child poverty went way down, dramatically dropped. And then as soon as the child tax credit expansion expired, it went right back up again. So this shows us that we do have the tools to reduce child poverty. It can be done, and it can be done relatively quickly.
Professor Hibble says ending poverty is a choice, but whether it's a choice the world's wealthiest country is ready to make remains to be seen. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
Okay, we're going to return now to our segment on poverty in the United States and looking at how children are adversely affected. For more insight into that, we're joined by Shawn Fremstad. He is the Director of Law and Political Economy at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Shawn, thanks very much. We certainly appreciate you taking time to talk with us.
Great, thank you for having me.
I want to start a simple question. What is poverty? What is the threshold in the United States? And do you think the official designation, does it go far enough?
Good question. So in the United States, we have a very outdated poverty threshold, and we typically define poverty as having a family having income under a particular threshold that's supposed to represent basic needs. So in the U.S., according to the quote-unquote official definition, if you're a single person, you're not poor if you have income over $15,000 a year. If you're, say, a family with 2 adults, 2 children, you're no longer poor after your income goes above $30,000 a year. I think the important thing to note about this is based, again, on a very outdated poverty standard developed in the 1960s, have never really been meaningfully overhauled since then. If you compare it to the international standard, which is typically 50% of median income, this U.S. poverty standard falls far below that 50% income. So we're really, by the official standard, we're really under measuring poverty in the United States, and we still have, what I think are very high poverty rates for a nation.
Shawn, I'll tell you, what you're saying is simply arcane. I challenge you as one individual to live on $15,000. I mean, you'd be homeless. But I grew up in Appalachia, and I remember former President Johnson waging the war on poverty and basically using my backyard as one of the areas it showed. And it was shocking back then, and clearly it has not been able to resonate through our houses in Congress in the United States. So how did the U.S. get to this point?
Yeah, so I would say it's a lot of sort of inaction. It was actually President Nixon who kind of locked, remember President Nixon, the peach? So Johnson was there. There was talk about updating the poverty measure back in the day, but that didn't really go anywhere during the Johnson administration. President Nixon came in and says, we're going to lock this in. We're only going to adjust it for inflation. So part of what you get is this thing that ignores, the extent to which housing prices, have gone through the roof in so many places. Really ignores kind of needs like childcare. It's just a very 1960s standard in a 2020 United States economy.
Let's talk about the communities that are most hard hit, and also if you're going to have that little amount of money, you're clearly going to be getting some kind of benefit from the federal government welfare, for lack of a better term. And I found that you can either feed yourself, have a full belly, or try to eat healthy for about 10 days out of the month. You can't do both. So talk about the health concerns and also the communities that are hit hardest.
Right. I mean, it's sort of, in terms of hard-hit communities, I would say, we know, for instance, the poverty rate's much higher among African Americans, Hispanics, but it's also very high just among the working class generally. And some of this it's interesting, some of this defining down of poverty since the 1960s that I've talked about in terms of the standard, it actually hits the kind of working class in poor-paying jobs hardest, because they're the ones that, they may be making $7 an hour, but they're no longer able to qualify for programs like food, like Medicaid. So, it hits people in different ways, but I think in general, it's very harmful. And obviously, I mean, even if you get food stamps, you're kind of struggling, or I guess we call it SNAP now, benefits, you're pretty much struggling to eat every day unless you have other income coming in. But SNAP is really the only, there is no cash. And I think people have this idea that we have a lot of cash welfare programs in the United States. And other than for people with very severe long-term disabilities, there just really isn't that kind of thing anymore. So people are really struggling. Maybe it's in-kind benefits they get that aren't even cash.
Sure.
So it's doubling up, it's going homeless, it's, not eating, it's all these sorts of things. And if anything, we've gotten, policy decisions have taken a wrong turn in the last couple of years, where we have conservatives in Congress successfully pushing for a tightening of and a big cutoff of people from the food stamp program. A particular work test.
I think you're exactly right, and there are some conservative news outlets that like to trumpet the welfare millionaires, and it simply doesn't happen. There are enough checks and benefits, checks and balances in place right now that's not going to happen in this day and age. Talk about the impact of the pandemic and the end of relief on programs and poverty rates.
Well, so it's interesting. The pandemic was obviously a horrible event, but in many ways, during the main crisis periods of the pandemic, the U.S. government responded in a way that really hadn't been the case before. So we had a very strong unemployment insurance response. We extended something called the child tax credit. So that's kind of like what other countries would call a child benefit or a child allowance. We made sure all low-income children could get it. We increased the amount of money. These programs, even though a lot of people were in very dire straits in terms of their ability, there weren't jobs, they weren't able to participate in the labor market. Right. These programs played a huge role in actually bringing the poverty rate down, in the later years of the pandemic. The problem we have now is those programs largely very successful, reduced poverty tremendously, but they were not kept operating in large part, again, to conservative opposition. So we had, the child tax credit expansion. This is a one-year expansion that reduced child poverty by 50%, really just an extraordinary accomplishment. Wow. But that was allowed to expire because we couldn't get the votes we needed to expand it.
Interesting. Shawn Fremstad, thank you so much. I definitely want to revisit this issue. Thanks very much for shining some light on that. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye.